Chapter 10 The Philosopher's Stone. Understand, ye sons of wisdom, the stone declares, protect me, and I will protect thee. Give me my own, that I may help thee. The Golden Treatise of Hermes. 1. Introduction and text. A rich and complex symbol of the self is found in the alchemist's idea, the philosopher's stone, the ultimate goal of the alchemical process. Some may wonder what value the fantasies of the alchemist can have for modern empirical psychology. The answer is that these fantasies express symbolically the deep layers of the unconscious and provide valuable parallels to help us understand the images that emerge today in the depth analysis of individuals. The very fact that the alchemists were psychologically naive and uncritical permitted the symbolic images to manifest themselves without distortion. Jung puts it this way: in order to understand the full range of a symbol's meaning, the investigation must turn back to those periods in human history when symbol formation still went on unimpeded. That is, when there was still no epistemological criticism of the formation of images, and when, in consequence, facts that in themselves were unknown could be expressed in indefinite visual form. The period of this kind closest to us is that of medieval natural philosophy. It attained its most significant development in alchemy and Hermetic philosophy. Jung says at the conclusion of Mysterium Cogitioris, alchemy has performed for me the great and invaluable service of providing material in which my experience could find sufficient room, and has thereby made it possible for me to describe the individuation process, at least in its essential aspects. The goal of the individuation process is to achieve a conscious relation to the self. The goal of the alchemical procedure was most frequently represented by the philosopher's stone. Thus, the philosopher's stone is a symbol for the self. Fragmentary descriptions of the nature and attributes of the philosopher's stone are scattered throughout the voluminous alchemical literature. A full study of the phenomenology of this image would require the sizable task of collecting these scattered materials. However, my purpose in this chapter is much more modest, and for this purpose I was fortunate to find in a single text a fairly full and detailed description of the philosopher's stone. The text I shall use is found in the Prolegomena to an anthology of English alchemical texts edited by Elias Ashmole and published at London in 1652. It reads as follows. 1. The mineral form of the philosopher's stone hath the power of transmuting any imperfect earthy matter into its utmost degree of perfection, that is, to convert the basest of metals into perfect gold and silver, flints into all manner of precious stones, as rubies, sapphires, emeralds, and diamonds, etc., and many more experiments of the like nature. But as this but a part, so it is the least share of that blessing which may be acquired by the philosopher's materia, if the full virtues thereof were known. Gold, I confess, is a delicious object, a goodly light, but as to make gold is the chiefest intent of the alchemist, so it was scarce any intent of the ancient philosophers, and the lowest use the adepti made of this materia. 2. For they, being lovers of wisdom more than worldly wealth, drove it higher and more excellent operations, and certainly he to whom the whole course of nature lies open, rejoiceth, not so much that he can make gold and silver, or the devils to become subject to him, as that he sees the heavens open, the angels of God ascending and descending, and that his own name is fairly written in the book of life. 3. Next to come to the vegetable, magical, and angelical stones, the which have in them no part of the mineral stone, for they are marvelously subtle, and each of them differing in operation and nature, because fitted and fermented for several effects and purposes. Doubtless Adam, with the fathers before the flood, and since, Abraham, Moses, and Solomon, wrought many wonders by them, Yet the utmost of their virtues they never fully understood, nor indeed any but the Maker of all things in heaven and earth, blessed for evermore. 4. For by the vegetable stone may be perfectly known the nature of man, beasts, fowls, fishes, together with all kinds of trees, plants, flowers, etc., and how to produce and make them grow, flourish, and bear fruit, how to increase them in color and smell, and when and where we please, and all this not only at an instant, but daily, monthly, yearly, at any time, at any season, ye, in the depth of a winter. 5. Besides, the masculine part of which is wrought up to a solar quality, and through it its exceeding heat will burn up and destroy any creature, plant, etc. That which is lunar and feminine, if immediately applied, will mitigate it with its extreme cold, and in like manner the lunar quality benumbs and congeals any animal, etc., unless it be presently helped and resolved by that of the sun. For though they both are made out of one natural substance, yet in working they have contrary qualities. Nevertheless, there is such a natural assistance between them, that what the one cannot do, the other both can and will perform. 6. Nor are their inward virtues more than their outward beauties, for the solar part is of resplendent, transparent luster, that the eye of man is scarce able to endure it, and if the lunar part be exposed abroad in a dark night, birds will repair to and circulate about it as a fly around a candle, and submit themselves to the captivity of the hand. 7. By the magical or perspective stone it is possible to discover any person in what part of the world soever, although never so secretly concealed or hid, in chambers, closets, or caverns of the earth, for there it makes a strict inquisition. In a word, it fairly presents to your view even the whole world, wherein to behold, hear, or see your desire. Nay more, it enables man to understand the language of the creatures, as the chirping of birds, lowing of beasts, etc., to convey his spirit into an image, which by observing the influence of heavenly bodies shall become a true oracle, and yet this is not any ways necromantical or devilish, but easy, wondrous easy, natural and honest. 8. Lastly, as touching the angelical stone, it is so subtle that it can never be seen, felt, or weighed, but tasted only. The voice of man, which bears some proportions to these subtle properties, comes short in comparison. Nay, the air itself is not so penetrable, and yet, O mysterious wonder, a stone, that will lodge in the fire to eternity without being prejudiced. It hath a divine power, celestial and invisible, above the rest, and endows the possessor with divine gifts. It affords the apparition of angels, and gives a power of conversing with them by dreams and revelations. Nor does any evil spirit approach the place where it lodgeth, because it is a quintessence wherein there is no corruptible thing, and where the elements are not corrupt, no devil can stay or abide. 9. S. Dunstan calls it the food of angels, and by the others it is termed the heavenly viaticum, the tree of life, and it is undoubtedly next under God, the true giver of years, for by its man's body is preserved from corruption, being thereby enabled to live a long time without food. Nay, 'tis made a question whether any man can die that uses it, which I do not so much admire as to think why the possessors of it should desire to live, and that have those manifestations of glory and eternity presented unto their fleshly eyes, but rather desire to be dissolved, and to enjoy the full fruition that live where they must be content with the bare speculation. 10. That there is a gift of prophecy hid in the red stone, Rhasis will tell you, for thereby, saith he, philosophers have foretold things to come, and Petrus Bonus avers that they did prophesy not only generally, but specially, having a pre-knowledge of the resurrection, incarnation of Christ, day of judgment, and that the world should be consumed with fire, and thus not otherwise than from the insight of their operations. 11. In brief, by the true and various use of the philosophers prima materia, for there are diversities of gifts, but the same spirit, the perfection of liberal sciences are made known, the whole wisdom of nature may be grasped, and notwithstanding what has been said, I must further add, there are yet hid greater things than these, for we have seen but few of his works. 12. Howbeit, there but a few stalks that are fitted to inoculate the grafts of the science on. They are mysteries incommunicable to any but the adepti, and those that have been devoted even from their cradles to serve and wait at this altar. Elias Ashmole, the author of this text, was not a practicing alchemist. He was a scholar of wide learning from the particular interest in alchemy and astrology, and gathered a large collection of books and manuscripts on these subjects. A personal note of interest was his relation to the alchemist William Blackhouse. The alchemist adopted Ashmole as his spiritual son. Quote, this was a signal event in Ashmole's life, one which he felt placed him in the long line of true sages. Close quote. 2 years later, Backhouse, seemingly on his deathbed, transmitted further secrets to Ashmole. Ashmole wrote in his diary that Backhouse told me in syllables the true matter of the philosopher's stone, which he bequeathed to me as a legacy. Ashmole's description of the philosopher's stone is undoubtedly a compilation of the qualities of the stone as described in the numerous alchemical texts with which he was familiar. Ashmole collected these scattered items, compounded them into an organic whole, bypassing them through his own rich imagination, and then giving them expression in his quaintly charming style. Ashmole describes the philosopher's stone as though it were 4 different stones, which he calls respectively the mineral stone, the vegetable stone, the magical stone, and the angelical stone. In our text, these 4 categories divide the power of the stone into different modes of functioning for purposes of description, but there is a deeper meaning than this. Throughout alchemy, the symbolism of the number 4 plays an important role. Fourness was considered to be the basic ordering principle of matter. In the beginning of the world, prior to creation, there was only the prima materia, which was without form, structure, or specific content. All was potential, nothing actual. In the act of creation, the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water, were separated out from the prima materia. It is as though the cross of the 4 elements had been imposed on the prima materia, giving it order and structure and bringing cosmos out of chaos. In order to produce the philosopher's stone, the 4 elements must be then reunited in the unity of a quintessence. The original, whole, and unified state of the prima materia is thus restored in the philosopher's stone on a new level. These ideas may have many parallels in the process of psychological development, particularly as a symbol of wholeness. The fourfold nature of the philosopher's stone immediately relates it to the fourfold mandala images of the self, and indeed we have alchemical pictures of the stone which are in the form of mandalas. In psychological terms, we usually consider the number 4 to refer to the 4 psychic functions, thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. However, this interpretation is by no means adequate to cover the full meaning of fourness. The 4 elements, for instance, cannot be equated with the 4 functions. It seems rather that the structuring pattern of fourness can emerge in a variety of contexts to bring order and differentiation to experience, but always it carries the implications of fulfillment or completion. Although Ashmole speaks of 4 different stones, in the discussion which follows, the actions of the different aspects of the stone shall be considered as deriving from a single, unitary philosopher's stone. 2. Transformation and revelation. The first paragraph of the text begins as follows. 1. The mineral form of the philosopher's stone hath the power of transmuting any imperfect perfection, that is, to convert the basest of metals into perfect gold and silver, flints into all manner of precious stones, as rubies, sapphires, emeralds, and diamonds, etc., and many more experiments of the like nature. But as this is but a part, so it is the least share of the blessing which may be acquired by the philosopher's materia, if the full virtues thereof were known. Gold, I confess, is a delicious object, a goodly light, but as to make gold is the chiefest intent of the alchemists, so was scarce any intent of ancient philosophers, and the lowest use the adepti made of this materia. According to the alchemical view, metals in the earth went through a gradual natural process of growth. The base metals, such as lead, were immature, early forms. Very slowly they would mature and grow into the noble metals, gold and silver. The alchemists thought that they could hasten the natural growth process by the procedures of their art. This idea is an obvious projection onto matter of the fact that natural psychological growth is fostered by paying attention and working on psychic content. Gold and silver were considered noble metals because they were incorruptible. They were not subject to rust or corrosion. Thus, they carried the qualities of unchanging consistency and eternity. Similarly, the experience of the self in the individuation process conveys to the ego the characteristics of reliable stability which make it less subjective to regressive decomposition. These ego qualities result from increasing awareness of and relationship to the transpersonal or eternal dimension of the psyche, which is an important aspect of the experience of the self. Turning lesser matter into gold can also have a negative aspect. For example, as presented in the legend of King Midas, he was granted his wish that everything he touched would turn into gold, but then was dismayed to find that his food became inedible. This story pictures a condition of identification with the philosopher's stone which is inimical to life. Man cannot live by eternal verities alone. He also needs bread, personal, temporal satisfactions. The text tells us that the stone converts flints into precious stones. Precious gems represent values, items which are treasured for their beauty and worth. Flints are dull, ordinary material, but quite hard. They would represent the banal, nitty-gritty aspects of life. Understood psychologically, this capacity of the stone refers to the ability of the integrated personality to perceive meaning and value in the most ordinary and even disagreeable of happenings. Likewise, inferior base aspects of oneself will be seen to contain value. Since beauty is in the eye of the beholder, it is a change in the perceiving attitude which brings the transformation. Ashmole feels obliged at this point to inform us that the making of golden jewels is the least of the stone's power. Although we are taking his description symbolically, he is taking it literally. He is like a dreamer describing his dream while still asleep in it, whereas we are trying to understand the meaning of his dream from the standpoint of waking consciousness. Gold making, we are told, was not the intent of the ancient philosophers. This statement corresponds to the widely expressed idea in alchemical works that our gold is not the common gold, but is philosophical gold. What is confusing is that after saying that this authors then proceed to talk about fires, flasks, and chemical procedures in the laboratory. The only explanation is that the alchemists themselves were confused. They were looking for a philosophical or spiritual content in a chemical procedure, and this was doomed to failure. However, in their failure, the alchemists left us a rich heritage of symbolic material which describes the phenomenology of the individuation process. Reference to the ancient philosophers brings up the whole question of the meaning of the term philosopher's stone. Philosopher means lover of Sophia, or wisdom. A stone is matter in one of its hardest forms and connotes solidity, permanency, and stubborn factuality. The philosopher's stone thus symbolizes something like a concretized or actualized wisdom. In aura consurgens, wisdom personified as Sempitia Dea is specifically equated with the philosopher's stone. However, the stone means more than wisdom meant to the philosophers, just as the stone means more than the figure of Christ means, if understood in the usual purely spiritual sense. Jung's comment about the stone's relation to Christ is relevant here, since Christianity took over the one-sided spirituality of Platonic and Stoic philosophy. The symbol of the stone, despite the analogy with Christ, contains an element that cannot be reconciled with the purely spiritual assumptions of Christianity. The very concept of the stone indicates the peculiar nature of this symbol. Stone is the essence of everything solid and earthly. It represents feminine matter, and this concept intrudes into the spheres of spirit and its symbolism. The stone was more than an incarnation of God. It was a concretization, a materialization that reached down into the darkness of the inorganic realm, or even arose from it, from that part of the deity which put itself in opposition to the Creator. We may therefore suppose that in alchemy an attempt was made at a symbolical integration of evil by localizing the divine drama of redemption in man himself. Paragraph 2 continues, 2. For they, being lovers of wisdom, more than worldly wealth, drove it higher and more excellent operations. And certainly he to whom the whole course of nature lies open, rejoiceth, not so much that he can make gold and silver, or the devils to become subject to him, as that he sees the heavens open, the angels of God ascending and descending, and that his own name is fairly written in the book of life. This paragraph is similar in tone to a passage in the Hermetic Museum. Neither be anxious to ask whether I actually possess this precious treasure. Ask rather whether I have seen how the world was created, whether I am acquainted with the nature of the Egyptian darkness, what is the cause of the rainbow, what will be the appearance of the glorified bodies at the general resurrection. In both passages, the experience of revelation is considered to be the important thing. Our text contains 3 biblical references. The first is in the 28th chapter of Genesis, where it is said Jacob dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven, and behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Jacob's ladder symbolizes the ego self-axis, as discussed earlier. The ascending and descending angels correspond to the alchemical procedures of sublatio and coaglatio, sublatio. Psychologically, this is the process of raising concrete personal experiences to a higher level, a level of abstract or universal truth. Coagliato, in contrast, is concretization or personal realization of an archetypal image. For the ascending and descending angels to be visible would mean that the personal ego world and the archetypal psyche are seen as interpenetrating. Blade expresses this state in his lines, to see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wild flower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. Of interest also is the fact that a stone was concerned with Jacob's dream. He had used the stone as a pillow, and after the dream, when he realized that the place is none other than the house of God, and that this is the gate of heaven, he set up the stone for a pillar. Jung suggests that Jacob's stone, which marks the place where upper and lower unite, may have been considered as equivalent to the philosopher's stone. The second biblical reference is found in Luke 10:19-20, where Jesus says to his 70 messengers, Behold, I have given you authority to tread upon serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall hurt you. Nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. The third reference is the term Book of Life, which is found in Revelation 20:15. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. In chapter 6, I have discussed the psychological meaning of having one's name written in heaven or in the book of life. It refers to the realization that one's individuality or personal identity has a transpersonal a priori or origin and justification for being. Such an experience is the definitive solution to an identity crisis, to use a currently popular term. It is also the answer to lesser conditions of alienation, unworthiness, and inferiority. The text tells us that the Philosopher's Stone has a revelatory capacity. It opens up the whole course of nature, reveals the connecting links between the personal and transpersonal, earth and heaven, dimensions of the psyche, and makes evident that one's personal ego has a metaphysical foundation and hence an undeniable right to exist in all its uniqueness. These effects correspond closely to the effects of an encounter with the symbol of the self that may emerge in dream or fantasy in the course of psychotherapy. For example, a woman with an alienation problem had this dream. An orphan child was placed at my doorstep at night. It seemed that it had an umbilical cord which reached into heaven. I felt completely fulfilled when I discovered it. I knew my purpose in life. The umbilical cord reaching to heaven is an explicit image of the ego-self axis. The theme of the orphan comes up as a description of the Philosopher's Stone. On the back of the stone mandala, he carved a bowling in. Young carved the following words deriving from alchemical quotations concerning the Philosopher's Stone. I am an orphan, alone. Nevertheless, I am found everywhere. I am one, but opposed to myself. I am youth and old man at one and the same time. I have known neither father nor mother, because I have had to be fetched out of the deep like a fish, or fell like a white stone from heaven. In woods and mountains I roam, but I am hidden in the innermost soul of man. I am mortal for everyone, yet I am not touched by the cycle of aeons. The text proceeds. 3. Next, to come to the vegetable, magical, angelical stones, they which have in them no part of the mineral stone, for they are marvelously subtle, and each of them differing in operation and nature, because fitted and fermented for several effects and purposes. Doubleless Adam, with the fathers before the flood and since, Abraham, Moses, and Solomon wrought many words by them, yet the outmost of their virtues they never fully understood, nor indeed any but God, the maker of all things in heaven and earth, blessed for evermore. The chief content of this paragraph is that Adam and the other ancient worthies were possessors of the Philosopher's Stone. This is a common assumption in alchemical texts, and it was thought, for instance, to account for the longevity that was enjoyed in those early days. In Judeo-Christian myth, the early patriarchs were considered to be almost semi-divine ancestors. They were in immediate contact with the source of being. God spoke to them and shared his purposes. They are eternal archetypal figures who continue to live in paradise. It is appropriate that they should have possessed the stone. The psychological parallel is that experiences of the self are often accompanied by an aura of antiquity. A specific aspect of the phenomenology of the self is its essentially timeless, eternal, and hence ancient quality. It conveys the sense that one is participating in a process of the ages which revitalizes the vicissitudes of the here and now. 3. The fertility principle. The text continues. 4. For by the vegetable stone may be perfectly known the nature of man, beasts, fowls, fishes, together with all kinds of trees, plants, flowers, etc., and how to produce and make them grow, flourish, and bear fruit, how to increase them in color and smell, and when and where we please. And all this is not only at an instant, but daily, monthly, yearly, at any time, at any season. Yeah, in the depth of winter. The stone here is described as the growth and fertility principle. This aspect of the stone corresponds to the saying of Jesus, quote, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly, John 10:10, An explicit identification of Christ with the fertility principle is found in an apocryphal legend concerning the flight into Egypt. On the way to Egypt, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus met a farmer sowing wheat. The infant Jesus picked up a handful of seed and threw it by the wayside. Instantly it grew, ripened, and was ready for reaping. As Joseph and his family hid in the tall wheat, a group of Herod's soldiers came looking for them. "Have you seen a mother and child?" asked the soldier. "Yes," said the farmer. "I saw her as I was sowing this wheat." "That must have been months ago," said Herod's soldiers, and they went away. Also, Osiris embodies the principle of life and fertility. An Egyptian coffin text says, "I am the plant of life, which comes forth from Osiris, which grows upon the ribs of Osiris, which allows the people to live, which makes the gods divine, which spiritualizes the spirits, which enlivens the living, which strengthens the limbs of the living. I live as corn, the life of the living. I am life appearing from Osiris." In antiquity, the fertility principle occasioned a great deal of worship. Sexual symbolism played a large part in these rites, since sexuality is obviously the source of life, and a means by which the transpersonal purpose of nature make men their instrument. The womb, the breast, and the penis are thus apt symbols for the life principle itself, which in the words of our text brings forth all forms of life, and knows how to produce and make them grow, flourish, and bear fruit. Considered psychologically, the growth-promoting qualities of the stone refer to the fact that the self is the fons et origio of psychic existence. Life, growth, and fertility are expressions of libido or psychic energy. This aspect of the stone is connected with the alchemical symbolism of the Benedicta Verdetos, the blessed greenness, which has links with Aphrodite, the spirit of vegetation, and the Holy Ghost. The fertility aspect of the stone appears at times in dreams. For instance, a young man who was going through a life transition was rather too closely involved with transpersonal energies, dreamed that where he walked the grass grew thicker and greener in the path of his footsteps. Another man had the following dream: "I see a man with a phenomenally long penis. He was a young man, and yet he seemed to be my grandfather. The penis was like a pipe and put together in sections. In order to get around, he took off the sections and carried them in a specifically fitted box." This figure is immediately identified as an aspect of the self by the fact that it is paradoxically both young and old, i.e. transcends the category of time. The philosopher's stone is frequently described in such paradoxical terms. The huge penis refers to the creative or fertility principle which we are discussing. Its size, which goes far beyond human proportions, indicates its archetypal or supra-personal nature. The fact that it is built in sections and has an artificial or constructed quality is reminiscent of the phallus of the reborn Osiris. Following his dismemberment, the original phallus was the one fragment which could not be found. Isis therefore replaced it with an artificial wooden one, with which Horus was conceived. Conception by a wooden phallus is a strange, non-human happening. It thus alludes to a transpersonal process beyond human or ego understanding. It perhaps points to psychic conception by a symbolic image rather than concrete reality. 4. The union of opposites. The text proceeds. 5. Besides the masculine part of it, which is wrought up to a solar quality, and through its exceeding heat will burn up and destroy any creature, plant, etc., that which is lunar and feminine, if immediately applied, will mitigate it with its extreme cold. And in like manner, the lunar quality benumbs and congeals any animal, etc., unless it be presently helped and resolved by that of the sun. For though they both are made out of one natural substance, yet in working they have contrary qualities. Nevertheless, there is such a natural assistance between them, that what the one cannot do, the other both can and will perform. We are here informed that the Philosopher's Stone is a union of two contrary entities, a hot, masculine, solar part and a cold, feminine, lunar part. This corresponds to what Jung has demonstrated so comprehensively, namely, that the self is experienced and symbolized as a union of opposites. The Philosopher's Stone is often described as a conjunctio of Sol and Luna. Many alchemical pictures attempt to depict this paradox. The text also describes the negative and dangerous qualities which each of these parts can have when it operates alone. The solar part, when encountered by itself, is destructive because of its excessive heat and intensity. This is reminiscent of Psyche's second task in the myth of Amor and Psyche. Venus had ordered Psyche to get a wisp of wool from a special flock of sheep with golden fleece. A friendly reed growing by the river gave Psyche this advice. Do not, at this hour, approach those terrible sheep, for they have borrowed fierce heat from the blazing sun, and wild frenzy maddens them, so that with sharp horns and foreheads hard as stone, and sometimes even with the venomous bites, they vent their fury in the destruction of men. But when the heat of the noonday sun has assuaged its burning, and the beasts were lulled to sleep by the soft river breeze, and when once the sheep have abated their madness and allayed their anger, go shake the leaves of yonder grove, and thou shalt find the golden wool clinging here and there to crooked twigs. Newman comments that the rendering golden rams of the sun symbolize an archetypally overpowering male spiritual power which the feminine ego cannot face. Close quote. Newman interprets the whole Amor and Psyche myth from the standpoint of feminine psychology, and certainly it is the woman who is most vulnerable to the destructive effects of one-sided solar power. However, the problem also applies to men. The one-sided solar component of the Philosopher's Stone in its destructive aspect is encountered psychologically, either internally or externally in projection. Externally, it may be experienced as a scorching by the fiery affect of another person. Internally, it may be encountered when one becomes identified with and consumed by a fiery anger emerging from the unconscious. In either case, there are damaging psychic effects from which it takes time to recover. Moderate or mitigated quantities of solar libido are creative, fructifying, and life-promoting, but a one-sided excess is inimical to psychic life. The text tells us that the lunar part of the Philosopher's Stone, when encountered by itself, may also be destructive because its extreme cold benumbs and congeals. The classic example of the benumbing, paralyzing aspect of the negative feminine principle is the myth of the Gorgon Medusa. To look at her turns one into stone. The man's ego is the one more vulnerable to this effect. For example, I once heard of the case of a young scientist who was enthusiastically involved in some important research. One day his mother came to visit him in his laboratory. She looked around and uttered some depreciatory remark concerning the value of what he was doing. That did it. It was enough to destroy the man's relation to his work for several days. His libido had been benumbed and congealed. He was relieved only when anger at the situation broke through to consciousness, i.e., when the solar component of the Philosopher's Stone resolved the one-sided effect of the lunar component. The congealing, benumbing effect of the lunar quality is an extreme form of the capacity of the feminine principle to promote coagliato, images and urges of a spiritual nature which would prefer to soar unfettered by the earth or obliged by the feminine eros principle to become related to personal, concrete reality. If the ego is too far removed from such reality, it will experience the encounter with the feminine as a paralyzing crash to earth. It can be quite helpful to realize that the damaging effects of the dangerous lunar power and the destructive solar power are, nevertheless, aspects of the Philosopher's Stone. When one is recuperating from the effect of an encounter with either of these potencies, it helps in maintaining one's orientation and perspective to know what he is suffering from is the stone itself. Anyone who would seek the philosopher's stone is bound, repeatedly, to become a victim of one of its partial aspects. These happenings constitute the alchemical operations which gradually bring about the transformation. But the operations are on ourselves. We experience the calcinatio of the solar fire, or the benumbing of the coagulatio of the lunar power. In the midst of these rigors, it is immensely helpful to know that they are part of a larger, meaningful process. The next paragraph speaks of the positive qualities of the solar and lunar components of the stone. 6. Nor are their inward virtues more than their outward beauties, for the solar part is of resplendent, transparent luster, that the eye of man is scarce able to endure it, and if the lunar part be exposed abroad in a dark night, birds will repair to and circulate about it as a fly around a candle, and submit themselves to the captivity of the hand. The positive aspect of the solar principle of masculine spiritual consciousness derives from the fact that it is light-producing. Everything becomes clear, shining and transparent in the intensity of the illumination. The experience of this aspect of the self may carry considerable numinosity and is generally accompanied by light symbols, brilliant illumination, shining countenances, halos, etc. William James comments on the frequency of light phenomena, which he calls photisms, in the experience of religious conversion. He quotes the description of such a case as follows: "All at once the glory of God shone upon and round about me in a manner almost marvelous. A light perfectly ineffable shone in my soul, that almost prostrated me on the ground. This light seemed like the brightness of the sun in every direction. It was too intense for the eyes. I think I knew something then, by actual experience, of that light, and prostrated Paul on the way to Damascus. It was surely a light such as I could not have endured long." In the course of analysis, illuminations of a lesser magnitude sometimes occur and are associated with characteristic dream images. Examples of such images can be found in the dream series published by Jung in Part 2 of Psychology and Alchemy. The experience accompanying these images is an expansion of awareness and increased understanding. It is an encounter with an aspect of the self, and hence very impressive. However, since only one side is constellated, the typical symbols of wholeness are not explicitly stated. The text also speaks of the positive aspects of the lunar part. What the moon means psychologically is very difficult to convey adequately in words. Erich Neumann had a splendid effort to do so in his paper, quote, "On the Moon and Matriarchal Consciousness," which I warmly recommend. In this paper he writes, "It is not under the burning rays of the sun, but in the cool, reflected light of the moon, when the darkness of consciousness is at the full, that the creative process fulfills itself. The night, not the day, is the time of procreation. It wants darkness and quiet, secrecy, muteness, and hiddenness. Therefore, the moon is lord of life and growth, in opposition to the lethal, devouring sun. The moist night time is the time of sleep, but also of healing and recovery. It is regenerating power of the unconscious, that is nocturnal darkness, or by the light of the moon performs its task, a mysterium in a mysterium, from out of itself, out of nature, and with no aid from the head ego." The text tells us that the lunar part of the stone will attract birds at night and cause them to accept captivity willingly. Birds, as elusive intuitions or spiritual potentials, are thus brought into reality by the lunar mode of being which is so well described by Neumann. We also have expressed here the theme of the taming of the wild creature. A parallel is the motif of the unicorn, who can be tamed only in the lap of a virgin. In alchemy, the unicorn symbolized Mercurius, the elusive spirit difficult to grasp and contain. In one text, the unicorn turns into a white dove, another symbol for Mercurius, and also for the Holy Ghost. Thus, the virgin who contained the unicorn will be synonymous with the lunar portion of the stone which brings birds willingly into captivity. These images refer to a certain attitude engendered by the lunar or yin aspect of the self, which brings wild, free, but undisciplined urges into relation to reality and into submission to the transpersonal totality of the personality. It is the taming of the wild willfulness which thinks it is sufficient unto itself. An actual woman may serve this function for a man. She must be virginal in the symbolic sense described by Esther Harding, i.e., one who belongs to herself and functions as an independent feminine being uncontaminated by masculine attitudes. In alchemy, the unicorn in the lap of the Virgin was clearly associated with the dead Christ in the lap of Mary. This brings the whole idea of the incarnation of the Logos into symbolism. Incarnation is an aspect of coagulatio. The alchemists were concerned with how to coagulate, capture or fix the elusive mercurial spirit. One way, represented pictorially, was to transfix the mercurial serpent to a tree or nail it to a cross, just as was done as Christ. Tree and cross are feminine symbols and hence equate with the Virgin's lap and the lunar aspect of the stone. These images defy facial explanation, but they'll surely have to do with the realization of the psyche as a concrete entity which is brought into effective, particularized existence by the lunar aspects of the stone. 5. Ubiquity. Paragraph 7 continues. 7. By the magical or perspective stone, it is possible to discover any person in what part of the world soever, although never so secretly concealed or hid, in chambers, closets, or caverns of earth, for there it makes a strict inquisition. In a word, it fairly presents to your view even the whole world, wherein to behold, hear, or see your desire. Nay more, it enables man to understand the language of the creatures, as the chirping of birds, lowing of beasts, etc., to convey a spirit into an image, which, by observing the influence of heavenly bodies, shall become a true oracle. And yet this is not any ways necromantical or devilish, but easy, wondrous, easy, natural, and honest. Nothing can be concealed from the stone. All is open to its view. It is ubiquitous. The stone is thus equivalent to the all-seeing eye of God. In the fourth and fifth visions of Zechariah, there is an interesting parallel to our text. In the fourth vision, Zechariah sees a stone with 7 eyes upon it. In the fifth vision, he sees a golden lampstand on which are 7 lamps. An angel tells him, "These 7 are the eyes of Yahweh. They cover the whole world." Young states that the certain alchemists interpreted these passages to refer to the philosopher's stone. The 7 eyes of God would correspond to the 7 planetary spheres and in alchemy to the 7 metals. They are the 7 steps on the ladder of transformation. The eye of God was a prominent image in ancient Egyptian religion. A coffin text says, "I am the all-seeing eye of Horus, whose appearance strikes terror, lady of slaughter, mighty one of frightfulness." This passage reflects the usual attitude of the ego upon encountering the experience of the eye of God. It is an anxious attitude in which one is afraid that his sins of unconsciousness will be found and judged. Since nothing can be hidden from the philosopher's stone, the stone will be felt as a dangerous threat by anyone who is trying to evade full self-awareness. The stone can see all because it symbolizes the complete, integrated personality which we will have no hidden, split-off aspects. For the same reason, it permits the understanding of the birds and beasts, which represents man's intuitive and instinctive wisdom. The image of the eye of God suggests a unified source of consciousness. within the unconscious. It perhaps also alludes to the phenomena of synchronicity. The eye as a circle is sometimes a feature of mandalas. For example, a Young's bowling stone is in the form of an eye with a pupilless figure, telesphorus within the pupil. The eye of God is a pictorial expression of the statement vocatos atuku non vocatos duas adere. Finally, this paragraph tells us that the stone can convey a spirit into an image, which by observing the influence of heavenly bodies shall become a true oracle. To convey a spirit into an image must refer psychologically to the capacity of the unconscious to express a vague, undifferentiated mood or affect in some specific fantasy image. This happening is what we seek in the process of active imagination. To bring an emerging unconscious content into consciousness, the immaterial must be clothed in matter. The disembodied, or better, the not yet embodied, must undergo incarnation. A spirit must be caught in some discernible form in order to become a content of consciousness. This is one aspect of the alchemical operation of coagulatio. Dreams perform this function, as do active imagination and other forms of imaginative creative expression. Our text says it is the philosopher's stone which performs the transformation of spirit into image. This corresponds to the old statement that dreams come from God. In other words, the image-making power of the psyche derives from its transpersonal center, the self, and is not a function of the ego. C.A. Meyer had reported a modern dream which is an exact parallel to our text. The dream reads as follows. I am lying on a couch. On my right, near my head, there is a precious stone, perhaps set in a ring, which has the power to make every image that I want to see visible in a living form. Meyer associates the couch to the recline or bed on which the patient slept when he visited the ancient shrines of Asclepius in the hope of receiving a healing dream. He speaks of the precious stone as a symbol of the self and says that it also serves as a yantra, charm, for the visualization of unconscious content. Our text adds that the image, when it is related to the influence of the heavenly bodies, becomes an oracle. The heavenly bodies, as planetary factors, would refer to the transpersonal forces, the archetypes of the collective unconscious. The idea seems to be that when one experiences the image-making power of the unconscious in context with an understanding of the archetypal dimension of the psyche, he is given access to an oracular, i.e., a broader, ego-transcending wisdom. Paragraph 8 continues. Lastly, as touching the angelical stone, it is so subtle that it can neither be seen, felt, or weighed, but tasted only. The voice of man, which bears some properties to these subtle properties, comes short in comparison. Nay, the air itself is not so penetrable, and yet, oh, mysterious wonder, a stone that will lodge in the fire to eternity without being prejudiced. It hath a divine power, celestial and invisible, above the rest, and endows the possessor with divine gifts. It affords the apparition of angels, and gives the power of conversing with them by dreams and revelations, nor does any evil spirit approach the place where it lodgeth, because it is a quintessence wherein there is no corruptible thing, and where the elements are not corrupt, no devil can stay or abide. Here again we are presented with the paradoxical nature of the stone. It is so invisible, diffused, and rarefied that we have no way of perceiving it but by taste. On the other hand, it is a stone, so solid and unchangeable that the eternal fire cannot weaken or crumble it. This is the theme of the stone, which is not a stone, which goes all the way back to Greek alchemy. Rulin says, quote, the stone, which is not a stone, is a substance which Petrine has regards as efficacy and virtue, but not as regards its substance. Close quote. The philosopher's stone is a symbol of the center and totality of the psyche. Hence the paradoxical nature of the stone will correspond to the paradoxical nature of the psyche itself. We speak of the reality of the psyche, but how many have the perceptive faculties to taste its real presence? If that oft referred to man in the street were to read this chapter, would he think that I was talking about anything real? Probably not. The majority of those that term their vocation psychology are not aware of the reality of the psyche. It is considered to be behavior, conditioned neurological reflexes, or cell chemistry, but the psyche itself is nothing. In the words of our text, it can neither be seen, felt, or weighed. For those who can perceive reality only in those terms, the psyche will not exist. Only those who have been forced by their own development or their own psychogenic symptoms to experience the reality of the psyche know indeed that although it is intangible, yet it is petrine as regards its efficacy. The fullest realization of this fact comes as the fruit of the individuation process. The text further tells us that the stone affords the apparition of angels, and gives the power of conversing with them by dreams and revelations. This is an elaboration of the image-making capacity previously mentioned. To be in contact with the self brings awareness of transpersonal meanings, here symbolized as converse with angels. The paragraph concludes with the statement that no evil spirit can approach the stone because it is the quintessence wherein there is no corruptible thing. Psychologically speaking, an evil spirit or demon is a split-off complex with autonomous dynamism which can possess the ego. Its existence is perpetuated by a repressive ego attitude which will not accept the split-off content and integrate it into the personality as a whole. Awareness of the self and the requirement of the total personality eliminate the conditions under which the autonomous complexes can survive. The quintessence is the fifth unified substance that results from the union of the four elements. It corresponds to the unified personality which gives equal consideration to all four functions. A single function operating arbitrarily without the modification and correction of the other functions is devilish. As Jung puts it, Mephistopheles is the diabolical aspect of every psychic function that has broken loose from the hierarchy of the total psyche and now enjoys independence and absolute power. As did Christ, the stone cast out the devils, i.e., partial aspects of the personality which try to usurp the authority of the whole. 6. Spiritual food and the tree of life. Our text continues. 9. S. Dunstan calls it the food of angels, and by others it is termed the heavenly Vidicum, the tree of life, and is undoubtedly next under God, the true giver of years, for by it man's body is preserved from corruption, being thereby enabled to live a long time without food. Natus made a question whether any man can die that uses it, which I do not so much admire, as to think why the possessors of it should desire to live, that have those manifestations of glory and eternity presented unto their fleshly eyes, but rather desire to be dissolved and to enjoy the full fruition, than live where they must be content with the bare speculation. This paragraph presents several ideas which require elaboration. The stone is called the food of angels. Ordinarily, one doesn't think of angels as requiring food. However, perhaps their condition is analogous to that of the dead spirits in the underworld as found by Odysseus. In order to bring forth the spirits, he was obliged to sacrifice 2 sheep and pour out their blood, which would attract the spirits who are hungry for blood. This is an interesting image, which expresses how libido must be poured into the unconscious in order to activate it. Evidently, something similar happens with angels. They need the food of the philosopher's stone in order to manifest themselves to man. Food is a symbol of coaguliato. Thus, the idea might be that the eternal angelic realm is concretized or brought into temporal existence via awareness of the self. The term food of angels also has a scriptural reference, referring to the manna from heaven sent to the Israelites in the desert. Wisdom 16:20 says, quote, "You have the food of angels, from heaven untiringly sending them bread already prepared, containing every delight, satisfying every taste." Close quote. The food of angels here is equivalent to bread from heaven, and in the 6th chapter of John, this term is applied to Jesus, who says, quote, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall not hunger, and he who comes to me shall never thirst." Close quote. John 6:35. The Catholic liturgy uses these texts as references to the Eucharist, which leads us into the next characterization of the stone. The stone is also called the heavenly viaticum. The viaticum is the Eucharist administered by a priest to a dying man. The word originally referred to money or necessaries for a journey. It derives from via, road or way. The journey a dying man takes is out of this world into heaven. The same note of death is struck later in the paragraph when Ashmole wonders why anyone with the philosopher's stone should want to stay alive. Thus, the stone promotes a kind of death to the world, i.e., a withdrawal of projections. To call the stone viaticum means that it has been equated with the body of Christ as prepared by transubstantiation in the mystery of the Mass. Melchior, an early 16th century alchemist, made the comparison explicit. He described the alchemical process in the form of the Mass, with the alchemist in the role of the officiating priest. In addition, Melchior Young has presented many other examples of the alchemist's tendency to equate the stone with Christ. Here we see an early effort of the individuation principle, based on the primacy of subjective experience, to take over and assimilate the central value of the prevailing collective religious tradition. A similar situation exists today between analytical psychology and religion. For those who no longer find traditional religious forms meaningful, analytical psychology offers a new context in which to understand the transpersonal symbols, a context which is appropriate to the most developed aspects of modern consciousness. The stone is also called the, quote, tree of life. This refers to the second tree in the Garden of Eden. After Adam had eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, he was expelled from the garden, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life, and eat, and live forever. The tree was henceforth guarded by the cherubim, and a flaming sword which turned every way. The stone will thus correspond to something that man was once close to, but having come to consciousness, awareness of opposites, the knowledge of good and evil, he has been separated from it. The individual's relation to the self evolves in this fashion. As discussed in Part 1, originally the nascent ego is contained in the state of unconscious selfhood, the primordial condition of totality which Newman has called the Ouroboros. With the emergence of ego consciousness comes painful separation from unconscious wholeness and the immediate relation to life symbolized by the tree of life. The ultimate goal of psychic development then becomes the recovery of the lost state of original wholeness, this time on the level of conscious realization. The philosopher's stone was not uncommonly described as a transcendent tree. Thus it relates to the well-known symbolism of the world tree or the cosmic tree. Just as Christ was the second Adam, so his cross was thought of as the second tree, the tree of life. An alchemist describes the philosopher's stone in these words: "On account of likeness alone, and not substance, the philosophers compare their material to a golden tree with 7 branches, thinking that it encloses in its seed the 7 metals, and that these are hidden in it, for which reason they call it a living thing. Again, even as natural trees bring forth divers blossoms in their season, So the material of the stone causes the most beautiful colors to appear when it puts forth its blossoms. Strange and impressive trees appear in modern dreams and drawings. Young gives a number of examples in his essay, The Philosophical Tree. A patient in the midst of a major resolution of the transference, dreamed that a huge tree came crashing to the ground. As it fell, he heard a high-pitched, unearthly shriek. This dream has an interesting parallel in a text describing the philosophical tree as the inverted tree. The roots of its oars are in the air and the summits in the earth, and when they are torn from their places, a terrible sound is heard, and there follows a great fear. The philosophical tree could undergo death and rebirth much like the phoenix. This dream could thus suggest that the whole personality was undergoing a developmental transformation. 7. The One in the All. The text continues. 10. That there is a gift of prophecy hid in the red stone, Rasis will tell you, for thereby saith he, philosophers have foretold things to come, and Petros Bonus avers that they did prophesy not only generally, but specially, having a pre-knowledge of the resurrection, incarnation of Christ, day of judgment, and that the world should be consumed with fire, and thus not otherwise than from the insight of their operations. The stone's capacity for prophecy means that it is connected with a transconscious reality which is beyond the categories of time and space. This corresponds to the phenomenon described by Jung, which he calls synchronicity. One of the ways that it may occur is by a meaningful coincidence between a dream or other psychic experience and some future event. Jung gives a number of examples in his essay on synchronicity. Such experiences are most likely to occur when the archetypal level of the psyche has been activated, and they have a numinous impact on the experiencer. The text especially mentions pre-knowledge of the resurrection, incarnation of Christ, day of judgment, etc. These are definitely transpersonal, even cosmic happenings. The implication would seem to be that the stone transmits knowledge of a supra-personal structure or ordering of things which is inherent in the universal itself, quite outside the structuring principles of ego consciousness, namely space, time, and causality. Jung speaks of his transpersonal ordering principle as subsistent meaning, and reports several dreams which apparently allude to it. One of them is as follows. The dreamer was in a wild mountain range where he found contagious layers of Triassic rock. He loosened the slabs and discovered to his boundless astonishment that they had human heads on them, in low relief. The term Triassic refers to a geological period about 200 million years ago, long before man had evolved. Thus, in the dream, the advent of man was prophesied, so to speak. In other words, man's existence was predetermined or inherent in the inorganic substrate of the world. A patient once brought me a similar dream. The dreamer was exploring a sea cave, examining various attractive stones polished by the tides. To his great surprise, he came upon a perfectly formed figure of the Buddha, which he knew had been created solely by the natural forces of the sea. Such dreams suggest that predetermined order, meaning, and consciousness itself are built into the universe. Once this idea is grasped, the phenomena of synchronicity is no longer astonishing. Surely it is not without significance that in both of these dreams the human form has been imprinted by nature on a stone. In fact, I would consider both dreams to be referring specifically to the philosopher's stone, the same stone which our text tells us has the power of prophecy. 11. In brief, by the true and various use of the philosopher's prima materia, for there are diversities of gifts, but the same spirit, the perfection of liberal sciences are made known. The whole wisdom of nature may be grasped, and, notwithstanding what has been said, I must further add, There are yet hid greater things than these, for we have seen but few of his works. For the first time, the text uses the term prima materia as synonymous with the philosopher's stone, and this is done in a passage which emphasizes the various and diverse aspects of the stone. On the first view, it would seem that the end is being confused with the beginning. The prima materia is the original first matter, which must be subjected to lengthy procedures in order, finally, to transform into the philosopher's stone. The goal of the opus, but such ambiguities are characteristic of alchemical thought, just as they are characteristic of the symbolism of the unconscious. Descriptions of the prima materia emphasize its ubiquity and multiplicity. It is said to have as many names as there are things. And indeed, Jung in his seminar on alchemy mentions 106 names for the prima materia without beginning to exhaust the list. In spite of his diverse manifestations, the source also insists that it is essentially a unity. Our text makes the same point. Quote, there are diversities of gifts, but the same spirit. Close quote. Thus, the philosopher's stone, the end of the process, has the same multiplicity in unity as does the original stuff at the beginning. The difference is that it is now a stone, i.e., concrete, indestructible reality. It is perhaps significant that the beginning of the alchemical process is referred to in this penultimate paragraph of the description of the goal. It suggests that a cycle is completed. The end is a new beginning in the eternal circulatio, and that the stone, like Christ, is both Alpha and Omega. In psychological terms, the theme of unity and multiplicity involves the problem of integrating the conflicting fragments of one's own personality. This is the essence of the psychotherapeutic process. The goal of this process is to experience oneself as one, but also the impetus to make the effort seems to derive from the unity that was there a priori all the time. Our text implies that unity, once achieved, must break into new multiplicity again if life is to go on. In the words of Shelley, the one remains, the many change and pass. Heaven's light forever shines, earth's shadows fly. Life, like a dome of many-colored glass, stains the white radiance of eternity. Our text concludes, 12. Howbeit, there are but a few stalks that are fitted to inoculate the grafts of the science on. They are mysteries incommunicable to any but the adaptee, and those that have been devoted even from their cradles to serve and wait at this altar. This page confirms an observation which has been gradually forming itself in my mind. It is my impression that those who go farthest in the process of individuation almost always have had some meaningful and indeed decisive experiences of the unconscious in childhood. Jung's childhood experience is an excellent example of this. What often seems to happen is that the inadequacies of childhood environment or the child's adaptational difficulties, or both, generate a loneliness and dissatisfaction that throw him back on himself. This amounts to an influx of libido into the unconscious, which is thereby activated and proceeds to produce symbols and value images which help consolidate the child's threatened individuality. Often secret places or private activities are involved which the child feels are uniquely his and which strengthen his sense of worth in the face of an apparently hostile environment. Such experiences, although not consciously understood or even misunderstood and considered abnormal, leave a sense that one's personal identity has a transpersonal source of support. They thus may sow the seeds of gratitude and devotion to the source of one's being, which emerge in full consciousness only much later in life. The text says this science can be taught only to a few. The knowledge of the archetypal psyche is indeed available only to a few. It derives from inner subjective experiences which are scarcely communicable. However, the reality of the psyche is beginning to find witness for itself. The Philosopher's Stone is a symbol of that reality. There is a healing power in the images that cluster around the symbol. It is a potent expression of the source and totality of individual being. Whenever it appears in the process of psychotherapy, it has a constructive and integrating effect. It is truly a pearl of great price. This symbol developed over a period of 15 centuries. It was enriched through the efforts of countless devoted men who were gripped by its numen. They worked largely alone, as individuals, without the support and containment of an institution. They encountered dangers both from without and from within. On the one hand, there were greedy princes and heresy hunters. On the other hand, were the dangers of solitude and the activation of the unconscious which it brings. The history itself testifies to the power of the lapis philosophorum, a power capable of enlisting the energies of so many talented men in its service. It is a grand symbol which has at last come within the reach of modern understanding.